May 23, 1945, Fort Clark, Texas. Captain James Morrison pressed his stethoscope against a woman's chest and counted heartbeats that came too fast, too weak. The scale beside him read 72 pounds. She was 19 years old. He had treated soldiers from Bataan, men who'd survived death marches, and none had weighed less than this girl standing before him in a threadbare uniform that hung like a shroud. Her eyes held nothing, not defiance, not fear, just the hollow emptiness of someone who'd stopped expecting to survive. Morrison stepped back. His hands, steady through 1,000 battlefield surgeries, trembled slightly as he made notes on his clipboard. The number stared back at him. 72. Before we continue, like this video and subscribe if you haven't. We share forgotten moments of history each week. Comment where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers worldwide. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, let's continue. The tent smelled of canvas and disinfectant. Texas heat pressed against the walls, making the air thick enough to chew. Morrison had examined 11 women so far that morning. The lightest weighed 68 pounds, the heaviest 94. All wore the same faded Wehrmacht gray, uniform sized for healthy soldiers now draped over skeletal frames. Their skin stretched tight over bones. Their hair fell out in clumps. Some had wounds that hadn't healed in months, wrapped in bandages stained dark with infection. Morrison looked at the line of women still waiting outside the tent. 42 more to examine. He pressed his thumb against his temple, feeling the beginning of a headache. He'd served in field hospitals from North Africa to Normandy. He'd seen men torn apart by artillery, burned alive in tanks, frozen to death in foxholes. But something about these women, these enemy soldiers who weighed less than children, made something break loose in his chest. And in that moment, staring at that number on the scale, he realized the war had destroyed more than armies. It had consumed everything, even those who'd worn its uniform. The convoy had arrived at dawn 3 days earlier, when shadows still stretched long across the desert. Sergeant William Hayes stood at the gates with coffee in hand, watching trucks roll in with their cargo of German prisoners. He expected men Afrika Korps veterans, maybe Luftwaffe personnel. The war in Europe had been over for 18 days. Victory celebrations had swept through the camp like wildfire, men cheering, guards pouring whiskey into tin cups, radios crackling with Truman's voice announcing surrender. But when the canvas tarps lifted, women climbed down. 53 of them, moving slowly, carefully, as if their bones might shatter with sudden movement. Hayes set down his coffee. The cup tipped over, spilling black liquid into Texas dust, but he didn't notice. He was staring at faces that looked like they'd been carved from wax, eyes sunken deep into skulls, hands that shook when they gripped the truck rails for support. They wore Wehrmacht uniforms, regulation gray faded to something like ash. The youngest was 16, the oldest 48. Most were in their 20s, women who'd been conscripted into auxiliary services when Germany began scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves. They stood in formation, years of military discipline holding them upright despite exhaustion that carved shadows beneath their eyes. One swayed where she stood. Hayes caught her before she fell, surprised by how little she weighed, how her uniform slipped loose when he helped her to a bench. She thanked him in broken English, the words coming out fractured, uncertain. Her name was Greta Hoffman. She was 19 years old. 3 months ago, she'd weighed 128 pounds. Hayes looked at the other women's hollow faces, trembling hands, bodies that had forgotten what health felt like. Fort Clark had held enemy personnel since 1942, mostly Afrika Korps soldiers captured in Tunisia. They'd settled into routines, playing cards, writing letters home, working in kitchens and repair shops. Some even worked on local ranches under minimal guard. But these women were different. They moved through intake processing like ghosts, answering questions in whispers, standing at attention because that's what soldiers did, even when dying. Hayes filled out paperwork with mechanical precision, writing down names and ranks and service numbers. The pen felt heavy in his hand. Behind him, the coffee stain spread through the dust like a dark bloom. Morrison arrived within the hour. The camp physician was a man who'd sewn up wounds and amputated limbs and written letters to mothers about sons who wouldn't come home. He'd seen starvation before prisoners liberated from camps in Germany, refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. But it still made something twist in his chest when he examined the first woman and found ribs like ladder rungs beneath paper-thin skin. "Step aside," he said to the nurses assisting him. "I need room to work." The medical examinations took all day. Morrison worked through lunch through the afternoon heat that turned the tent into an oven. 72 pounds, 68, 81, 94. The numbers varied, but the pattern was clear. These women were dying. Malnutrition, dysentery, tuberculosis, infections that had gone untreated for months. Their teeth were loose from scurvy. Their gums bled when they spoke. Some had burns that had never healed properly, skin puckered and twisted where fire had touched them. Morrison ordered immediate hospitalization for 12 of them. The others were placed on strict medical supervision, their rations carefully calibrated to prevent refeeding syndrome, a condition where starving bodies, suddenly given adequate food, go into shock. He explained this to Hayes while washing his hands in a basin, water turning gray with dust and sweat. "Where were they held?" Morrison asked. "Brittany," Hayes said. "French coast. Wehrmacht evacuated them ahead of Allied advances. Looks like they spent time in a holding facility near Hamburg before being transferred here." Hamburg had burned in 1943. Firestorms consuming the city. Temperatures hot enough to melt glass. Morrison dried his hands slowly. If these women had been anywhere near those ruins, it explained some of what he was seeing. But not all of it. The systematic nature of their malnutrition suggested something more deliberate. Rations withheld, medical care denied. Women considered expendable in the final collapse of the Third Reich. Lieutenant Barbara Chen was one of the nurses assigned to the medical ward. Born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, she'd joined the service in 1943, served in England tending bomber crews. She wasn't prepared for what she found that first evening. Women barely alive, lying in metal frame beds, breathing shallow and labored. Morrison's orders were precise: morphine for pain, IV fluids when possible, constant monitoring. "Some might try to refuse food," he told her. "Others might eat too much. Both will kill them." Chen made notes, but her hands trembled. The woman in the nearest bed, Greta Hoffman, was watching her with eyes that held no animosity, no hatred, just exhaustion so profound it seemed to radiate like fever heat. "Do you speak English?" Chen asked quietly. "A little," Greta whispered. "You are Chinese?" "American," Chen said firmly. "But yes, my parents came from China." Greta closed her eyes. "I have never seen Chinese person before." The conversation ended there, but it was a beginning. Over the following days, Chen and the other nurses worked 12-hour shifts, feeding patients with eyedroppers when they were too weak to hold spoons, changing dressings, monitoring temperatures. The women improved slowly. Color returned to faces. Hands stopped shaking. Some began to sit up, to speak in longer sentences, to ask questions about where they were and what would happen to them. The answer was uncertain. The war in Europe had ended, but treaties hadn't been signed. Repatriation plans hadn't been finalized. Germany was divided into occupation zones, Berlin a ruin, millions displaced and homeless. Sending these women back to that chaos felt cruel. Keeping them indefinitely felt wrong. So they remained in limbo, prisoners who were also patients, enemies who were also victims. Hayes found himself thinking about that distinction more than he wanted to. He'd fought in the Pacific before being reassigned stateside, had seen what Japanese forces did to prisoners, had friends who died at Bataan and Wake Island. He'd come home believing in clear lines, us and them, good and evil, victory and defeat. But these women complicated everything. They wore German uniforms but hadn't chosen their service. They'd followed orders but hadn't committed atrocities. They'd survived horrors inflicted by their own side as much as by Allied bombs. One afternoon, a recovered prisoner approached him. Her name was Ilse Werner, 32 years old, a former signals operator who'd served in France. She spoke better English than most of the others. Her face still looked gaunt, but her eyes had regained focus, sharpness. "Sergeant," she said formally, "I wish to request work assignment." Hayes looked up from his paperwork. "You're still recovering." "I am strong enough. And idleness is—" She searched for the word unbearable. "We sit all day. We think too much." He understood that. The camp's male POWs had been requesting work assignments for years, not just for privileges or pay, but for the simple mercy of distraction. Men needed purpose even in captivity. Apparently, women did too. "What kind of work?" Hayes asked. "Anything useful, kitchen, laundry, sewing. We are trained for support roles." Hayes made a note. "I'll bring it up with command." "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "The nurses here, they are kind. This is not what we expected." "What did you expect?" Ilse's expression flickered. "Revenge." The word hung between them before she saluted the crisp Wehrmacht salute, now technically illegal, and walked away. Hayes watched her go, recalling newsreels of liberated concentration camps, bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors resembling these women when they'd arrived. These specific women hadn't committed those crimes, but their country had. Treating them cruelly would feel like becoming what they'd fought against. Major Thomas Bradford approved work assignments for recovered prisoners. Within a week, German women worked in the laundry, sorting linens and operating industrial washers under American supervision. Others helped in the sewing room, mending uniforms, repairing fabric. A few with clerical experience handled administrative tasks, filing papers, and organizing records. Integration was gradual, awkward, with tension and unexpected connection. American soldiers who'd lost brothers in Europe sometimes couldn't meet these women's eyes. Others offered exaggerated courtesy, as if kindness could balance the scales of war. Male POWs watched with pride, resentment, and confusion, their own captivity seeming less harsh than the women's suffering. After 3 weeks, Greta left the medical ward, having gained 16 pounds, still thin, but no longer skeletal. Cleared for light duty, she worked in the camp library, organizing shelves, cataloging books, and occasionally recommending titles to prisoners who asked. Chen visited her there one afternoon, finding Greta reading a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath with a German-English dictionary beside her. "How is it?" Chen asked. "Sad," Greta said simply, "but beautiful. Steinbeck understands suffering." Chen sat down across from her. They'd spoken several times since that first night, conversations that stayed carefully neutral: weather, health, simple observations. But something in Greta's voice now invited deeper connection. "Did you suffer?" Chen asked quietly. "I mean before you came here, in Germany." Greta closed the book slowly. "Yes, but many suffered more. I am alive." "That's not an answer." "No." Greta looked at her hands, fingers still too thin, nails that had grown back ridged and discolored. "We were stationed in Brittany, communications unit. When Allies invaded, we were supposed to evacuate inland, but orders kept changing. We moved from camp to camp. Food became scarce. Medicine ran out. Some women died from illness, others from bombs. I watched my friend Margot bleed to death from shrapnel wound because we had no supplies to treat her." She said this matter-of-factly, as if reciting a weather report, but her hands trembled against the book cover. Chen said nothing, just listened. "Then we were captured by French resistance," Greta continued. "They were not kind. We were German, you understand? We represented everything they hated. They kept us in a cellar for 2 weeks before Allied forces took custody. By then, several more had died. The rest of us, She gestured vaguely at herself, like this. "I'm sorry," Chen said, and meant it. Greta looked up sharply. "You should hate me. I wore that uniform. I served that regime. Did you have a choice? Does anyone?" The question lingered between them, unanswerable, heavy with implications that neither wanted to fully examine. Chen stood, preparing to leave, but Greta spoke again. "Why do you treat us well? Americans, I mean. You have every reason for cruelty." Chen considered her answer carefully. "Because cruelty is easy. Humanity is harder. And if we become cruel, what did we win?" By midsummer, the German women had become part of the camp's routine. They worked their assignments, attended medical checkups, participated in recreation hours where they played cards and wrote letters to families they hoped still existed. Some learned more English, practicing with guards and nurses who were patient with their accents. Others remained withdrawn, locked in memories and trauma that would take years to process. The camp held a 4th of July celebration. Fireworks visible from the barracks, music drifting across the compound. Greta stood at a window, watching colored light bloom against darkness, and thought about other fireworks she'd seen. Tracer fire over Normandy, explosions tearing through Hamburg, the world burning in every color of the spectrum. These were different. These were celebratory, joyful, marking independence and victory. She felt no resentment, only a strange detachment, as if watching from outside her own life. Ilse approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory they'd drunk in Germany. The Americans had luxuries that seemed impossible after years of rationing. "They are happy," Ilse observed, nodding toward the Americans celebrating outside. "They should be. They won. We lost." Ilse sipped her coffee. "But I am glad it is over. Does that make me a traitor?" Greta smiled faintly. "If so, we are all traitors. I cannot mourn the Third Reich. I can only mourn what it cost." That night, several women wrote in makeshift journals, thoughts flowing in German script across salvaged paper. These diaries would survive decades, eventually donated to archives, primary sources for historians. Greta wrote about fireworks, Chen's kindness, the strange mercy of American captivity. Ilse wrote of guilt not for her acts, but for what her nation had become. Katharina Schmidt wrote a prayer, thanking God for survival and asking forgiveness for feeling grateful in defeat. In August, news arrived that Germany had surrendered, occupation zones were being established, and denazification had begun. Male POWs at Fort Clark grew restless, anxious about their futures, snapping at guards and each other. The women remained calmer, perhaps because they had already survived worse, internalizing a different kind of resilience. Morrison conducted final medical exams in September. The woman who'd weighed 72 pounds now registered 96, still underweight, but alive and healing. Tuberculosis cases stabilized, infections cleared, hair and teeth improved. "You've done well," Morrison told Chen. "Most would have died without proper care." Chen accepted the praise, uneasy that basic medical competence felt extraordinary. In October, orders arrived. The women would be repatriated in November to Bremen, then displaced persons camps. Greta received the notice while shelving books. Chen asked if she was afraid. "I do not know," Greta said. "Germany is rubble. My city Dresden is gone. My family—" Chen replied, "I'm sorry we couldn't keep you longer." Greta answered simply, "You saved my life. That is enough." In the final weeks, the women prepared for departure, gathering belongings, photographs, and letters of gratitude. Hayes organized a small farewell with coffee and pastries. The women arrived in civilian clothes, clean, respectable, ordinary. Not prisoners, not soldiers, just people preparing for an uncertain journey. Ilse approached Hayes, extending her hand in the American style rather than saluting. He shook it, surprised by her firm grip. "Thank you," she said, "for treating us as human. Hayes nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he wasn't sure he deserved. "Good luck. I hope you find your family." "And I hope," Ilsa said carefully, "that you never forget we were your enemies. But also that we were women. Both things can be true." She walked away before he could respond, rejoining the other women preparing to leave. Hayes watched them, thinking about the strange mathematics of war, how millions died while individuals survived, how hatred could be both justified and insufficient, how mercy didn't erase crimes but might prevent future ones. The convoy departed November 12th, trucks rolling out at dawn as they had 7 months earlier. But the women now were different from the skeletal figures who'd arrived. Still thin, still marked by trauma, they moved with strength, purpose, and the resilience that comes from surviving the impossible. Greta sat near the rear, watching Fort Clark recede. She thought of the medical tent where Morrison first weighed her, the library where she'd read Steinbeck, the window where she'd watched fireworks bloom in darkness. She remembered Chen's quiet kindness, Hayes's awkward courtesy, the strange mercy of American captivity that let her feel human again. She would return to Germany ruins, occupation, uncertain future, but carry the memory of this place. This unexpected mercy, proof that even after war, humanity could survive if people chose to protect it. The trucks rolled through the Texas desert, dust rising like memory itself visible, then fading, never forgotten. 53 women entered Fort Clark averaging 84 pounds. They departed at 118. 12 had been near death. All survived. Morrison's 1947 paper on starvation recovery informed care for displaced persons throughout Europe. Chen became a trauma psychiatrist, keeping Greta's photo until her death in 1993. Greta returned to Dresden, worked as a librarian for 37 years, and corresponded with Chen until 1967. The camp closed in 1946, converted to a seminary, then a museum. Nothing remains of their presence but photographs and records, women in borrowed dresses, alive despite every expectation. 72 pounds. By November, Greta weighed enough to stand, work, hope. Each pound reflected more than medical treatment. It reflected daily choices to see enemies as humans, to preserve life, and to show mercy. History should remember moments like these, where even after war compassion endured,